Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sex Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ainsley Caswell. I'm so glad you're here with us, and I'm glad that I'm here. This is my first full-length show for the GSMC Sex Podcast, and I hope you find it interesting. So since you don't know me, let's do a little introduction. Who am I exactly, and why am I hosting a sex podcast? Well, I am a voice artist and a narrator, primarily, at this time in my life. And ever since I began this career in 2013, a pretty significant amount of my work has come from the romance and erotic side of literature. And I'm sure just one of those reasons is because of the tone and timbre of my voice. But some other areas of my life also dip into areas of sex work and also sex education. I was a stripper in what you would call a traditional strip club in the early 2000s for roughly a year or so of my life, both in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. But when the recession got extra bad, I transitioned into fetish work in people's homes, and I was finding people online in various ways, negotiating with them, and I was servicing kinks and fetishes privately. Not long after I stopped doing that, I got involved in, to be frank, multi-level marketing companies that sold erotic and sex-related products. And while there is a lot of negative things to say about multi-level marketing companies, the ability to both sample and see and touch and experience sexual products in the privacy of your own home is very appealing to many people. So I did that for several years, and then I started getting more advanced in my voiceover career, which, again, focused on romance and erotic material. You may not realize that there's an awful lot of flexibility with literature labels out there, and something that's labeled romance can sometimes be pretty intense. So, if you're the type of person who enjoys erotic audio, you might be able to cash in some of your Audible credits and still get some pretty intense stuff. That may very well be a topic you'll see here later on, because although I am not a high-volume consumer of erotic material, I used to create a lot of it. And I did do my research occasionally, so I would have some recommendations for those of you that are looking for something special. But not today. Today, I want to cover a topic that affects everyone, all of us, every single one of us, even if you don't realize it. And that's the general overarching topic of sexual stigma. Stigmas regarding sex are something that has been present for certainly as long as any of us can remember, because it's been present forever. But at least since we were able to effectively communicate and judge one another, because that's really what stigma is based on. Something that seems to be a real crux in the judgment of other sexual behaviors and also expectations that are set for large groups of people is religion. There has been a fair amount of research done about the relationship between religion and sexual behaviors, and unsurprisingly, there is a distinct relationship between how religiously active someone is and their sexual activity. Many people are more likely to delay their first time, often until marriage, or at least that's what they think they're going to do. And a lot of attention has been given to Christian-based faiths, just because it tends to be the single dominant faith. And because there's so many variations in Christianity, behaviors and expectations tend to change. There are some findings that Muslims and Hindus may have a more conservative attitude towards sexual activity than Christians, which is something that may surprise you, or maybe it doesn't. The other half of this conversation is the restriction put on women in any type of community, regardless of the religion. When women have less mobility and less choices, it has a direct impact on both the expectations and the behaviors within these communities. There are many countries that still restrict a woman's ability to physically move outside of her house and engage in any kind of public life. The information seems to suggest that 4 out of 6 Muslim-dominant nations restrict a woman's mobility, and 6 out of 18 Christian-majority nations restrict a woman's mobility as well. And while all of these things factor into people's individual sexual choices, when we have this conversation, we're really talking about overall sexual activity and orientation. It's really a conversation that is dominated by how much sex a person is having, when they begin having it, before or after marriage, and also discussions about orientation, heterosexual versus homosexual, and going outside of a monogamous relationship. Those are most of the things that I'm seeing in formal studies and the larger social conversation. The things that don't seem to be discussed as much, and something that I ran into on a regular basis when I was working as a sex worker, is stigma around individual sex acts or preferences. Things like fetishes, kinks. Orientation is included in this too, because sometimes someone may be married to what society deems a correct and traditional partner, but their actual wants and needs are not being met by that partner. Something that I experienced repeatedly was servicing clients who were in relationships and they were simply terrified to share their wants and needs and preferences with their partner, partners that they were married to, partners that they had spent years with, partners that they had children with. Sometimes that family structure dictated even more of their shame. They thought they had more to lose if they were to disrupt the status quo or upset their partner. And this is a topic that I'm finding doesn't seem to be analyzed or studied. This may be in part because this type of stigma that I'm referencing right now is generally internalized sexual stigma, because it's based on a person's own perception of how they may or may not be judged because of their preferences. The other types of sexual stigma that we should separate in the conversation are enacted sexual stigma, which is an actual act of discrimination or violence towards someone for their sexual preferences or their orientation. There's also felt sexual stigma, which is the discomfort and oppression that someone may experience when society stereotypes them and places labels on them due to their sexual preferences or their orientation. This can very easily be confused with the internalized stigma, which we create within ourselves, because oftentimes, in order for someone to further internalize stigma, they feel that they have been oppressed by society. And whether or not that's true, the internalized stigma and internalized oppression will continue and likely intensify. Again, when we're talking about these different types of stigma, we're still largely talking about just someone's orientation and being a part of a sexual minority group. We're not often seeing information, data, definitions that reflect stigmas about people's individual preferences, even if they belong to the sexual majority group. When we are talking about those preferences, it's very much linked to sexual minority groups. For example, if you tried to look up some information about how stigmatized is anal sex in society, largely you get information, studies, and definitions that involve men having sex with men. It's not about the larger conversation of the entire population and the individual sex act of anal penetration. It is specifically in the optics of male-male relationships, and do these people perform that sex act, and how stigmatized is it? So since I can't get that information very easily, or it doesn't exist because we don't have that conversation, I decided to ask my follower base on one of my platforms, and 54 people weighed in. I was only able to give them a few options on what to vote for, but here are the results. The question I posed was, which of these items do you think is most stigmatized? Is it anal, multiple partners, sex work, fetishes and kinks, or orientations other than 100% straight? 9% of people chose anal. 20% said sex work. 22% said multiple partners. 48% said fetishes and kinks. And 0 people out of the 54 who voted said orientations other than 100% straight are most stigmatized out of this list, which is shocking when it comes to perception, because most of the information and formal studies out there are based solely around the concept that there is known stigma surrounding the LGBTQ community. But the perception, at least of the people who voted in my very informal survey, the perception of these people is that there is no oppression, or it's not as much as these other 4 options that I gave them, which, again, was anal, multiple partners, sex work, and fetishes and kinks. I'm unsure of the exact details of who these people are who voted, but I do know, based on my demographics, that the vast majority of my followers are men from the United States. Because of the type of material that I produce and the persona that I put out into the world, we can largely assume that most of these men skew towards being straight. I have no additional information on their race or religious affiliations, but I do know that they're largely male and American. Knowing that, and also seeing how they responded to this question, I think we can draw certain conclusions about the diversity in this voting group. So, with all that being said, the actual item that brought in the most votes for being the most stigmatized in society is fetishes and kinks. This doesn't shock me at all. It's very much something that I dealt with when I was a dancer and when I moved on to doing one-on-one work. Getting some of this information out of people when you're supposed to be servicing them was like pulling teeth. Even though someone may seek out a sex worker or go into a strip club voluntarily, there is still an immense amount of shame that is happening even when they're at the place where they can get the thing they want. Over and over again, I saw a huge amount of shame surrounding things like foot fetishes or any other fetish that had to do with a non-traditional body part. I once had someone who wanted to pay me to lick my armpit. I had someone who wanted to pay me to lick my shoe. A man in Las Vegas paid me to take off my knee-high stockings so that he could put them on. And then he bailed on our VIP dance when his credit card was declined. I had a private client once who paid me to do a babysitter-type role play because he wanted to be treated like a child, and he found that that was sexually exciting to him. There are some very simple answers for why some people fall into these types of fetishes, but rather than understand them, for example, this man had convinced himself that if he shared this information with his wife, who he had children with, that she would assume he was a pedophile. And he felt unable to share this information with her. He thought that she would leave him, take their children away, and it would ruin his life. And so he chose to go outside of his marriage to a sex worker to make his fantasy a reality, to see if it was something that he really wanted. And he chose me. During this process, I discovered that some of his fantasy involved anal play, and that was also very difficult for him to accept, explain. And there's a fear that you will be perceived as gay if you are a man who wants any sort of anal play. And that's something that becomes both felt and internalized. There are conversations that happen within very casual groups of people. I've been a part of them, where people make jokes about, oh, that's a butt thing. It must be a gay thing too. And a lot of men still don't want to experience that. And I think that factors very strongly into the results that I got, where most people felt that fetishes and kinks were something that was socially stigmatized, and they probably don't feel comfortable sharing. I met many people that were deeply uncomfortable sharing something that they wanted or a very clear sexual preference with their established partner, mostly because they didn't want that person to judge them or leave. Now, while there isn't a whole lot of formal information out there about society's stigmatized views of very specific fetishes, kinks, and sex acts, we do have Google. And in a quick analyzation of the most common Googled terms of fetishes in the United States, we see that there are things like fisting, voyeurism, wax play, humiliation, sports gear, suits, whipping, edging, balloons, group sex, armpits, cuckolding. I'm not even sure what sports gear refers to, but the people in Kansas are into it. There's many things on this list that I saw firsthand when I was a sex worker, namely things like nylons, foot fetishes. Both Indiana and Nevada are very interested in armpits, so I wasn't lying to you. There's also cuckolding, which I get asked about on my electronic platforms on a fairly regular basis. Voyeurism is very popular. Used underwear is something that the people in Oregon apparently are very interested in. And I have seen that in the strip clubs, where patrons will offer to purchase the clothes right off your body. Some of these things are not surprising, and things that you see represented even in pop culture. California is very into wax play. Florida is interested in piercings. I think those are two very good examples of things that we don't find very shocking because we see them in pop culture, we see them represented in movies and television. In Ohio and Tennessee, it looks like, and one of the Carolinas, there is a preference for suits or formal wear or some sort of uniform. And I think that's something that we would find normal, and we see it represented in our society constantly. Meanwhile, there's other categories like masochism, sadism, erotic electrostimulation. We don't see those categories as often, and thereby they seem to become more socially stigmatized. Georgia's top result is hair fetish. And although this may seem very benign and you wonder, is this even a real thing? When I think about whether or not this is represented or visible anywhere in our society, the only thing I can come up with is Joe Biden. Especially leading right up to the election, Joe Biden's repeated behavior of putting his face in or towards women's hair or heads was very, very publicized. It was turned into memes. The right tried to use it as an excuse for why he was a horrible person. And it was only discussed in the context of, this is gross, this is inappropriate, and it shouldn't happen. I acknowledge that there is a huge portion of that conversation that is about consent, because he's doing this visibly, in public, in front of cameras, to children sometimes. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the only instance of this type of preference that we can really call to largely in our society is a very negative one. It was deliberately shaped as being negative, to be used as a weapon against a political figure. And that shapes people's overall perception of not just an actual fetish that people might have. We don't actually know if Joe Biden has a hair fetish. It's just blatant speculation. But it also shapes people's perception of any sort of sexual preference that deviates from what we consider normal. When we look at the broader needs on Google of the United States, we find that the Midwest is largely interested in group sex and sports gear. I still don't know what that means. The West is mostly interested in masochism, as is the South, but they're interested in suits and masochism. The Northeast is interested in things like BDSM, foot fetishes, group sex, nylons, sadism. We're very diverse here in the Northeast. When we round up the country as a whole, masochism is by far the most searched Google term when it comes to fetishes and nuanced sexual preferences, followed by group sex and sadism. This does kind of line up with the responses from my followers. 22% of them did say that multiple partners were stigmatized, or they felt that it was stigmatized. And group sex falls into that category of multiple partners. I would consider my label of multiple partners to be a bit more all-encompassing, to also include relationships that people label as poly, which is a term that has become very common and popularized, especially in recent years. Even when I was younger, in my dating life, and especially when I was in school, there was no such term as that. We would talk about people dating casually as just that. You're dating somebody casually, you're just seeing this person, you're seeing or talking to multiple people. This behavior existed, but we didn't have a specific word for it at the time, and now people refer to it as poly. Though the term does help specify the parameters of your relationship, when somebody says they're in a poly relationship or they are poly, they date in that capacity, it typically refers to having multiple people that you are seeing and having a relationship with, but very specifically highlights that everyone should know what's going on and everyone should be on the same page. The stereotype of the player guy or player girl who is dating multiple people, none of whom know about each other, even those people today don't try to call themselves poly. And if they do, I think they're very aware that they're doing it wrong. But even though we've come up with this very sanitized term for people who openly date multiple people, it's still something that many people keep close to their chest because they're aware that there is a certain amount of stigma about people who do not date in a heterosexual, monogamous way. And I think that nicely leads us into the next topic I'd like to tackle, which is the perception of sex work.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Now that we've rounded out what sexual stigma is and how it functions in society, I'd like to talk about something a little more specific. 20% of my respondents said that they thought that sex work was the most stigmatized out of the options that I gave them. And I don't think we need to look much farther than very recent pop culture in order to see that that is very true. Even though I have a fair amount of personal experience about sex work being socially stigmatized, something larger caught my eye over the past several weeks on The Bachelor, of all things. An analysis of which would be its own monster, considering that we just finished talking about how multiple partners and poly-type relationships are still viewed in a certain light among certain people. The Bachelor franchise has managed to establish a well-loved formula of one person dating upwards of 20-some-odd people, all at the same time. But there seem to be conditions that come along with that. Whenever contestants on shows like this, and specifically this has happened in The Bachelor multiple times, whenever they engage in a purely sexual act, which of course they don't show, it's all very implied and veiled, speculation about those sex acts will show up on the front page of magazines. It will be newsworthy for weeks and months. What seems to happen is a contestant will get sexual with someone or multiple people, and then there is an avalanche of judgment and shame that comes from it. I think there's a lot to be said in how this information is presented, because would there really be as much media coverage or outrage, real or imagined, if these types of interactions were not presented to us in a certain way? The dramatic music, the jump cuts, the sound effects. This is something that's often very specific to reality TV, and it has come up multiple times across many, many television shows, where a woman, generally, is a part of a production and then engages in some sort of intimate or sexual activity, or it is assumed that she has done so. And then there comes a lot of analysis and judgment and name-calling even. But something far more serious happened on this most recent season of The Bachelor, which has already been fraught with more instances and drama and changes than I think we've ever seen before. If you're not already aware, the longtime host of The Bachelor, Chris Harrison, was removed recently because of the instances regarding racial insensitivity that occurred with a contestant and then Harrison's feedback on the subject. This whole issue completely overshadowed the other piece of drama that occurred during filming, which I didn't even know about because it didn't seem to get any media coverage. And I found out because I decided to watch those glorious After the Final Rose episodes at the conclusion of this season. At this time, I'd like to extend my personal thanks to streaming services for allowing me to binge watch trash TV whenever I want, but only the episodes that I really want to see. And right now, that included the final 2 episodes of this season of The Bachelor. So what did I learn? Well, because they're always trying to be new and innovative with their very predictable formula, The Bachelor occasionally tries to shake things up. And mid-season, apparently, they brought in a series of new girls for Bachelor Matt James, is that his name? For Matt to bring into the competition midway after he had already established some relationships with the existing women from the beginning and many had already been sent home. This is not new or innovative. They didn't come up with this idea. I remember it happening in season 3 of Rock of Love. If anyone, did anyone else watch it? No, it was just me? Okay. I think it may have happened on Flavor of Love, too. In any case, the Bachelor franchise is not the first one to try to shake things up mid-competition by introducing completely new contestants. This is an excellent device to upset contestants, make people angry, create drama, create a lot of emotion in a very tight time period. The existing contestants who have been there from the beginning immediately get defensive and resentful and feel very much entitled to the time and the work that they have put in, all 3 weeks of it, into getting to know this man who many of them are focused on marrying. And it prompts people to do and say things that are pretty extreme. When they employed this trick on the most recent season of The Bachelor, several women were brought in mid-season to start a relationship with Matt. The existing women in the competition had to deal with this fact and were confronted with it, and very specifically are asked to react to it. The nature of being on a reality show is that they are documenting your reaction to everything in real time. So even though we're told explicitly and have been told for years that these shows are largely unscripted, the truth is the situation is constructed very much on purpose, and people are in a fishbowl with cameras around them, and they're expected to react to it. There's an incentive on behalf of the producers and the network to create situations that are challenging so that they can see and record and broadcast extreme reactions. When these girls were brought in mid-season, there was one in particular, named Brittany Galvin, who made a very fast impression on The Bachelor. She kissed him upon her arrival, not unheard of, but again, she was being framed in a different light because she was brought in mid-season. This is how shows like this get their content. The existing contestants who had been there from the beginning had various visceral reactions to what was happening. this is the content that the show is looking for. One of the original women who started at the beginning of the season, named Anna Redman, took it upon herself to have discussions with other women in the house that they all share that she had certain information about Brittany Galvin because they were both from the same area, Chicago, and Anna claimed that they knew some of the same people, and some of those people had reached out to her specifically to share the information that they believed Brittany Galvin was a sex worker and an escort. Anna Redman began to openly discuss this with other contestants that were still in the competition, and it's really not difficult to understand that she was doing it in order to discredit Brittany Galvin and make her somehow unappealing or unattractive within the context of what they were doing, which was a dating competition vying for the attention and commitment of one man. Brittany Galvin's comments on this situation very much clearly indicate that this all happened very quickly, within the course of 24 hours after she arrived on the show. There began to be gossip and speculation within the house specifically about her being an escort and what everyone thought of that. And similar to the hair thing with Joe Biden, this piece of information, whether it's true or not, was very specifically wielded as a weapon against this woman. After the season closed, Anna Redman was able to specify that the reason that she did this was all based on fear and insecurity. She never actually came out and said that she made up this information. I believe she still maintains that she was told by third parties that Brittany Galvin was a sex worker. And it's really about what she did with this information and how she intended to affect Brittany in the competition or in life by sharing it with others and allowing it to create a stigma around Brittany so that she didn't get a one-up on anybody. So even if we completely don't pay attention to whether or not this factoid is true or whether or not the original source was Anna Redman, the point is that the accusation of being a sex worker was used against somebody in order to devalue them. Even in the conversations that followed, it was largely about how this would negatively affect Brittany. What would happen to her going forward, that this will be attached to her name on the internet for a very, very long time. That was largely the conversation that surrounded this issue. Very briefly, at the end of a segment where she's talking to Chris Harrison, Brittany was able to articulate that sex work is work and should be respected, and no one who is in the industry should be thought of as lesser than. And this is a very important statement. It's ultimately the goal to destigmatize things like sex work so that those people are not thought of as lower valued, lesser than, failures, unworthy of love, which was the very specific agenda of this rumor. This rumor was created and shared for the purpose of painting Brittany Galvin in a negative light so that a partner would not pick her or further his relationship with her. It seems very clear that that was the intention behind this rumor from the get-go. And when we're talking about stigmas and sexual stigmas, that's really the whole crux of this story, is how people treat one another when they find out certain information about their sexual habits, sexual preferences, or how sex functions in that person's life. We can, again, argue that a huge portion of this perception is shaped by the producers of shows like this, the media, and how they decide to highlight certain topics and deal with them. But none of that changes an individual's behavior when it comes to them discovering new information about someone who is different than them, and then what they choose to do with that information. Because if we run with the assumption that Anna Redman is not a plant or an actress, it is accurate that she took this information that was unsubstantiated and used it to hurt another person. We see this on much smaller scales all the time, every day. In schools, as teenagers, when young people start dating, there immediately are perceptions and accusations of what type of sexual being everyone is. Then we very quickly get into labels and name-calling. That person is a slut. That person is a prude. Oh my God, that person isn't a virgin anymore. Let's talk about the age that they were when they lost it and how many people they've been with since. People's perception of sexual behavior and how we're told we're expected to view it and have opinions on it starts very, very early in our lives. You see a lot of internalized misogyny, women calling each other sluts, women discrediting other women for their sexual behavior. It shows up in the "I'm not like other girls" meme, where women are, ironically, essentially trying to sell themselves to a prospective partner with some sort of social currency. A not like other girls girl will attempt to paint herself in a certain light that is deemed acceptable and positive in society. Girls will even self-identify as very sexually engaged and sexually active, and I am a slut, but I'm only a slut for my man. And I'm only a slut under certain conditions. It's conditional, and that makes it okay. But everyone else who acts like that, with no borders and no conditions and there are no rules, those people are worse than me. I am better than them. I have evolved above that type of behavior. That's very much the narrative that surrounds the not like other girls phenomenon and things related to it. Something that seemed to be popular when I was younger and I was in school was the idea of women being bi-curious, but ultimately being straight when they enter a relationship. This intensely fetishizes women who are lesbians, are bisexual, have some other type of preference that is not strictly heterosexual. And it's perpetuated in a densely social environment where many people are discovering their sexuality for the first time. And girl-on-girl relations are very much presented as being pleasurable for the onlookers and not occurring for the pleasure of the participants. I have a fair amount of personal experience of not just witnessing, but being a part of public displays of affection between women that were initiated simply for the audience at the party. If two girls start kissing, the entire room pivots and watches them, and many people start cheering. Body shots, I think, were entirely created just so a room full of people could observe one girl putting her mouth on another girl's body. And that shapes the perception of that type of interaction. You wouldn't see a guy take a body shot off of another guy at a college party, even if those guys might be gay. The overall social agreement is that girl-on-girl stuff is hot as long as it's purely sexual and I find the participants attractive. And guy-on-guy stuff is not something we want to see. And with that, I'd like to go into a topic that is surely familiar to you, though you may not have heard the term for it. Let's tackle heterosexism. And after that, because we've had an awful lot of heavy topics today, stick around to find out which fictional character do people most want to have sex with? What's your answer?
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
what exactly is heterosexism? Where is it present? And how does it affect us? I've attempted to shield you from some of the most boring material thus far, because much of the research done on the topics of sexual stigma is actual formal research. And when you search the topic, you end up finding a lot of actual reports that are constructed by universities, law schools, and many other large institutions. And information presented in that way is not always palatable to the public at large. But I would like to read directly from this paper by Gregory M. Herrick, entitled Sexual Stigma and Sexual Prejudice in the United States, a Conceptual Framework. In the section titled A Framework for Conceptualizing Sexual Stigma, he explains, "It is the stigma attached to any non-heterosexual behavior, identity, relationship, or community. In other words, it is socially shared knowledge about homosexuality's devalued status relative to heterosexuality. Like other stigmas, it creates social roles and expectations for conduct that are understood and shared by the members of society, regardless of their own sexual orientation or personal attitudes. Most people in the United States know that homosexual desires and conduct are regarded negatively relative to heterosexuality, and they are aware of the malevolent stereotypes that are routinely attached to individuals whose personal identities are based on same-sex attractions, behaviors, relationships, or membership in a sexual minority community." He goes on to explain, "The power differential at the heart of sexual stigma is perpetuated by structural sexual stigma, which is referred to here as heterosexism. By embedding sexual stigma in society's institutions, including religion, the law, and medicine, heterosexism ensures that sexual minority individuals have less power than heterosexuals." Now, I find this study and these statements and the whole concept very, very fascinating, considering the small sample responses that I received from my followers. Absolutely none of the 54 respondents thought that not being heterosexual was stigmatized enough to put it above any of the other options. Even though we can see proof of this in our history over and over again, this report specifically highlights Nazi Germany, which had state-sponsored persecution and violence that resulted in the imprisonment and death of many sexual minority individuals. A 1992 study, also headed up by Gregory Herrick, concluded that violence was the inevitable price that homosexual people paid when they became visible to heterosexuals, and the perpetrators of these acts were rarely arrested or prosecuted. The overall sentiment was that the victims were at fault for inviting the attacks, just because they were not heterosexual. We can point to many examples in the 80s, during the AIDS crisis especially, where the government refused to even acknowledge that it was a problem for far too long until it was completely out of control. In a 2008 study, also, again, headed up by Gregory Herrick, they found that between 1991 and 2004, the FBI recorded more than 14,800 incidents based on sexual orientation, representing approximately 17,000 victims. In any given year, sexual orientation incidents have comprised about 11 to 17% of all bias crimes reported to the FBI. And similar to the way that we look at other statistics involving sexual violence, we have to speculate that many of these crimes likely go unreported and unrecognized. These numbers only reflect what the FBI is measuring. Herrick acknowledges this issue in his 2012 study, saying, "These studies have demonstrated that victimization is widespread, but because they used convenience samples, the extent to which their results are generalizable cannot be determined." In a study that sampled 662 individuals who self-identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, 13% of the respondents had experienced violence against their person based on their sexual orientation at least once during their adult life, and 15% had experienced a property crime. Approximately 1 in 5 reported experiencing one or both types of crime, A staggering 38% of gay men reported experiencing one or both types of crime, compared to 13% of lesbians and 11% of bisexual men. In this particular study, 21% of gay men had objects thrown at them, 35% reported being threatened, and 63% had experienced verbal abuse. Also, 11% of respondents had experienced housing or employment discrimination because of their sexual orientation. Such discrimination was significantly more likely to be experienced by gay men and lesbians compared to bisexual men and women. This 2012 study that I am primarily referencing also does a very good job of separating the types of stigma, which we discussed earlier. Felt stigma from external sources versus internalized self-stigma. Felt stigma has a very, very strong basis in the perpetuation of stereotypes. And this study does tackle that phenomenon, saying, although most heterosexual Americans today do not believe that gay men and women are child molesters, the stereotype continues to be invoked in anti-gay discourse. Now, this 2012 study identifies this very clearly and even points to a different study in 2004 in order to substantiate the claim. But we can see very clearly that this type of social behavior and the perpetuation of this stereotype is occurring on a regular basis all the time. It is still occurring right now in almost every conversation in regards to bathroom laws and trans individuals being able to function in society just like anybody else. There is a repeated and very generalized accusation that these people are predators, molesters, that they are somehow out to get us or our children. And this narrative was very, very present in all of the conversations in recent years surrounding bathroom laws. It almost always immediately dips into the territory of pedophilia, where these groups of people are immediately accused of not just being predators, but being predators looking for children. This felt stigma translates into many individuals hiding their sexual identity in order to prevent any sort of attack. And this coping strategy can lead to chronic concealment of their sexuality, which is a huge task to undertake in your day-to-day life and results in many people in these communities struggling at higher rates with things like anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts. The good news is that many of these views seem to be shifting. Herrick's 2012 report summarizes that since the early 1970s, there has been a general opinion that sexual relations between two adults of the same sex are always wrong or almost always wrong. Between the years 1973 and 1993, they were considered always wrong by more than 2/3 of those who were surveyed. That would be above 66% for those of us who don't like thinking about math very much. However, in 1993, that number dropped to 54%, and unfortunately has stayed fairly stable since then, clocking in at 57% in 2004. Both of these numbers are still higher than the percentage of people who respond negatively to premarital sex. Condemnation of premarital sex has never been very strong and has remained fairly stable during the 1990s, ranging around 30%. So what does all this information actually tell us? It tells us that there is a distinct stigma against those who are not heterosexual, and often there is active discrimination and acts of violence against these individuals. And with that, there is an automatic elevation of those who are heterosexual, and that heterosexuality is better, more accepted, the correct way to do things. And when we talk about heterosexism, that's really what we're discussing. And what we have been discussing largely on this topic is society at large groups of people, larger demographics. But this information is very, very relevant in individual personal relationships. There is something referred to as bias or prejudice reduction, which can occur when an individual who has a certain understanding or held belief about a minority group has exposure to a single person who is a part of that minority group. The best way to explain this might be to create a hypothetical where you're at Thanksgiving dinner and your Aunt Janice has a tendency to say kind of outlandish and unfounded things about minority groups that she is not exposed to, like the gay community, the trans community, any other community of people that she doesn't really have any exposure to, but she still has formed opinions of these people based on her life experience, her social experiences, the media, etc. Then, one of your cousins comes out as gay, which forces your Aunt Janice to confront all of her previously held beliefs and assumptions about that community of people. Her established relationship with that family member who has now identified themselves as homosexual will now shape her new view of that community of people that she was previously not exposed to. We've also seen this repeatedly in society and in media. Most notably, it makes me remember Dick Cheney and his daughter, Mary Cheney, who came out as gay. This example is not a great reflection of prejudice reduction, as the Cheneys seem to treat Mary Cheney's sexuality as a don't ask, don't tell issue. The Cheneys have 2 daughters. Liz Cheney is married to a man and has children, and the family will openly discuss her business and her marriage and her children, but they will stay silent about Mary Cheney's private life. Once, when Lynn Cheney was interviewed about Mary Cheney making a declaration about her sexuality, Lynn Cheney responded with, "Mary has never declared such a thing." And she went on to further criticize the media for having any interest in the details of Mary's sexuality. So what do we ultimately learn from all of this? We already know that people who are heterosexual already encompass the majority of our society. But with that comes a lot of power and their ability to discriminate and push out those who are not like them. This type of discrimination occurs across many different communities and all over the world. We're talking about a lot of this type of discrimination in the US when it comes to race relations. The UK dealt with it with Brexit. In many areas of the developed world, we are finally tackling the issue of wealth inequality and how it affects people long-term, how it affects them in legal policies, how it affects them in terms of opportunities and quality of life. Overall, the argument for any of these topics seems to be, we are better than this. But unfortunately, on the other side, there always seems to be a group of people who believe that this oppression is correct, that they are superior, and they will continue to oppress those who are not like them, as long as they have the power to do so. Which seems awfully bleak, doesn't it? And just so I don't leave you in a state of emotional despair, why don't we close out with something a little more fun? As promised, when we come back, I'll summarize which fictional characters do you want to have sex with?
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Well, what did we learn today, kids? We were a little all over the place, but I'd like to think that we did a pretty good job of sticking to the topic of sexual stigmas. And I thank you and applaud you for still being here after our last pretty serious topic of heterosexism, which I don't know if anybody wants to discuss. But I promised you something fun, didn't I? And I will deliver. I would like to round up which fictional character do you most want to have sex with? And where else would I go for this information but an archived Reddit thread? The absolute gold mine of content creators. And I'm going to join the party. So, before we get started, who do you think you're going to see on this list? Fictional characters, any fictional characters. There is no specification for them needing to be played by real people, for them being animated. Go wild. Anything. So who do you think is going to be on this list? I'm guessing that I'm going to see at least one reference to Jessica Rabbit, Sailor Moon, maybe. And I'm really only saying that because she's one of the only female anime characters that I can recollect. Maybe Pam from The Office. Not just because Jenna Fisher herself is an attractive individual, but the character of Pam seems like someone that at least a few people would somehow want to conquer. I would say Angela also, except the perception of Angela as a character is very different than Pam. Angela is shown to us very distinctly as someone who is outwardly prudish, but gets down with her man. So in the context of what we're talking about, which is what fictional character do you most want to have sex with, I don't know if Angela will show up on here because she won't seem like a conquest. Angela's not easy, but she does willingly participate. Okay, obviously I'm thinking far too deeply about all of this. Let's see what people said. If I sort these responses by top, meaning the most voted for, the top response is your girlfriend. Welcome to Reddit, everybody. The first real response that we have that is the most highly voted is Jasmine from Aladdin. Okay, if we're going to get into the Disney stuff right away, I have a feeling about 2 or 3 comments later, we have someone who says, I was an Ariel fan myself. Thanks to her and Jessica, I have a redhead fetish. Ding, 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 I win. So somebody right off the bat references Jessica Rabbit. I don't know if we're going to see more support for this topic. I wouldn't be surprised if we do. The next one down, Elastigirl. Now, I wonder if this is because of her appearance or her capabilities. She's very flexible. But also, I can't help but think of that meme that went around the internet of, I believe it was a screenshot from Mad Men where Don Draper is standing in front of some kind of presentation board making a pitch, and it's a screenshot of that, and the presentation board says, "We at Pixar give every mom a dump truck ass." So, hey. Elastigirl brings a lot of stuff to the table, if we're being honest. The next one that I see that I can't give any specific commentary on is Rogue from the original X-Men cartoon. Now, I'm familiar with some of this stuff, but not all of it, and I honestly don't know who this person is. But I can Google things. I have that capability here. Okay. Oh, all right. I get it. Well, visually, she looks like a pretty standard superhero. Buxom, tight bodysuit, very interesting and stylized hair. She's cute. Next answer, Dexter's mom from Dexter's Laboratory, not the serial killer Dexter. Now, if I remember correctly, wasn't Dexter's mom and any adult figure in Dexter's world, wasn't that vantage point, as the viewer, we only saw those people from the waist down? This is a very common and old cartoon thing where adults or people who are not the main characters, we only see them in parts. We only see parts of their body. Or we don't see them at all, and they don't have a real voice, a la Charlie Brown. So I don't remember what Dexter's mom looked like or how she was presented to us, but it may have been only her lower half, which, that speaks to some people's preferences. But I should even see if I'm correct. I can, check and I'm wrong. I'm actually wrong. No, yeah, they represented the adults in full figure, head to toe. She was shaped like I don't know, what is this? Dexter's mom in Dexter's Laboratory is kind of shaped like the pin on Google Maps that gets dropped in your, like, you are here location. Her hips are like a big, big circle, but then extend down to the teeny tiny point of her toes. One of the follow-up comments on the Dexter's mom answer is, she was mad thick. Well, that's true. That's definitely true. Kim Possible. Kim Possible is the next one down. And I was not a Kim Possible watcher. And now I'm thankful for that, so that I don't have to have my memories poisoned. Next answer is Spider-Gwen. Well, you can't. We're back to the superhero stuff. I don't think it's really debatable that a female vigilante in a skin-tight catsuit is attractive. I think that's just a universal accepted truth. Next answer, whatever character Natalie Portman is playing. Decent answer, but a follow-up poster is smart enough to point out, I hope you remember that she is a former child star, so you better be specific there, buddy. Doesn't this also apply to the Kim Possible answer? Wasn't Kim Possible a child? I mean, I was under the assumption that she was. If I'm wrong, I won't Google it. If I'm wrong, I'll let one of you correct me. Next answer is, guys, I honestly cannot believe nobody has said Mystique. Ah, Mystique. Wasn't that, again, my ignorance is showing, wasn't Mystique the blue character that Rebecca Romaine Stamos played in the film? I remember very distinctly because it was newsworthy that her costume was not a costume, that it was largely body paint and stick-on things, and then the rest of it was done in CGI. So it goes without saying that the character is intensely sexual because she's seen as being nude. Is she nude? Is that her? I know that's her skin, but again, educate me. We're still on the superhero track with someone weighing in, I feel like Steve Rogers would be really gentle and generous. Now, I may not know a lot of stuff, but I do know that we are referencing Captain America here. And the fact that they specifically said Steve Rogers and not Captain America implies that they think that being with who he was before Captain America, that is more appealing. But who's to say? Who's to say? He is from the 1940s and may have some antiquated views about women and sexuality, but I'm overanalyzing. Oh, we have a live-action answer, meaning a character that is not animated, Kaylee from Firefly. The additional commentary is, and I want to watch her eat strawberries. I'm sure that's a reference to the show, which I've never seen, but that doesn't preclude me from knowing who she is. If I'm not mistaken, Kaylee from Firefly is played by Jewel Staite, who is a Canadian actress, and she came up as a very young child actor. And if you're like me, you remember her from at least 2 Nickelodeon shows and maybe something on Disney as well. But she's been in the public eye for many, many years, for clearly the majority of her life. And unfortunately, like many actresses, deals with the over-sexualization of herself and her characters. But I know that Firefly has a very passionate cult following, and with that tends to come a lot of passion, and that will often translate into over-sexualizing the characters. Oh, here we go. We have a single response that is just Jessica Rabbit. I am validated in my opinion. I predicted it, and I am proud. One of the responses from another user calls to her iconic line, she's not bad, she's just drawn that way. Icon. Android 18, also going right over my head, don't know what that means. Lola Bunny. Okay, I do know who this is. Although Space Jam was not a part of my regular rotation as a youngster, I do know obviously she's just Bugs Bunny's counterpart. She's Bugs Bunny's female equivalent. And when I review images of her, it's actually pretty refreshing to see that she doesn't look that much different from Bugs Bunny. She's drawn in a very similar fashion. She is given some curvature, of course, which does sexualize her in a big way, but there doesn't appear to be any additional details that heighten her sexuality, such as cleavage for breasts that don't exist. They don't draw makeup on her, which they will do often with animated characters just to differentiate them as female. She doesn't even have the exaggerated doll-like eyelashes that occurs many times. She does have a small little flare at the corner of her eyes, but it's very, very minimal. And this is something I was not familiar with until just now. Apparently there is a distinct conversation happening about the original Space Jam Lola Bunny and the new Lola Bunny, where she was desexualized in a few different ways visually in her styling. Her breasts were made to be far less prominent. She is wearing more clothes that do not expose her midriff. So that's progress, and she's still sexy, obviously. She's on this list. Black Widow. Okay, yeah, I should have seen that one coming a mile away. Scarlett Johansson seems to be another one of those actresses who is over-sexualized no matter what she does, no matter what choices she makes. Lara Croft. Of course. I find that very predictable, even though I'm not what you would call a gamer, and I've never played Tomb Raider. The phenomenon of Angelina Jolie embodying this role when it came to being made into a film, it was almost newsworthy that she was cast in the role. People were very excited that she so much authentically looked like Lara Croft. It was something that people were very excited about. Another answer is Cortana. You mean like the Microsoft voice? Yeah, I can't identify. I hate Cortana because she interrupts my life when I don't want her to. Like, randomly, from across the room while the television is on, I'll hear Cortana say, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that." You're really killing the vibe, Cortana. Oh, someone said Velma? Yeah, I think it's pretty well known that a lot of people have a certain affinity for the Scooby-Doo gals. Wonder Woman, duh. Wonder Woman is kind of that, the epitome of the female superhero and what she represents, especially when it comes to things like strength. Even before we had the new versions of Wonder Woman, the original depiction of her by Linda Carter is nothing short of iconic, really. And because that character is such a strong presence in a lot of young people's formative years, it can shape your feelings for the rest of your life. That was a great sample of responses, and I may have to stop now. Who did you want to see appear on that list who you didn't see? I didn't see nearly enough live-action characters, such as, I mentioned him earlier, and I'll mention him again. Why didn't anybody say Don Draper? Come on, folks. Come on. If you're disappointed with the results of this thread, please direct them to the Reddit complaint department, which doesn't exist. Thank you so much for listening to this inaugural episode of the GSMC Sex Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network, and you would be doing me a solid if you subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That will really help me. Also, don't forget to follow us on all of the places where you get content, like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I can't wait to see you next time. And until then, I'm Ainsley Caswell.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.